Hi. Oh, I just love your shoes. Perfect color on you. Let's go right over here. Table just opened up. The chefs will be so glad you're here. Have fun.
Hey, look who it is.
Welcome in. Welcome to A Minor Diner, where we take a recent music release, give it a theme, and pair it with two other works of art to create a three-course meal. We've got an appetizer, an entree, and a dessert to make our meal du mois, our meal of the month. I am your base chef, Zach. I'm here with my treble chef, Jesse. And Jesse, what are you doing? Stop doodling. We have guests.
I'm not doodling, I'm designing.
Designing what?
Parking lot.
Parking lot. Hey, you are extremely lucky that Hawaiian shirt guy was actually the surveyor. I had to cancel all my credit cards, and what even is there to design with a parking lot? It's just a bunch of rectangles.
Just a bunch of rectangles.
Don't overcomplicate things. It's just a big square.
There's a big boulder in the vacant lot, apparently. If you go in the trees, I guess there's this big...
So what?
So what? So I need to design around it.
We'll just move the boulder.
Move it. Okay, Sisyphus. It's a boulder.
Then we just demolish it or something.
Yeah, sure. We'll just blow it up. Some innocent diner sitting out on the patio gets a rock through their noggin because we can't just design around it.
Fair. Let me see what you have.
One sec.
That doesn't even look like a parking lot.
How many sides does a dodecahedron have?
No, you're getting your parking lot. Don't ruin it with some monument.
Why not? Why should our parking lot just be like everyone else's?
It's just a parking lot.
Nothing is just anything. Or at least it doesn't have to be. Not if you look at it long enough.
Did you get that? Is that Buddhist?
No, I think it's from Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Or Cars 2.
Well, wherever it's from, it's a good sentiment. And that brings us to this month's Meal du Mois and our theme. Keeping yourself curious.
Many people tend to think of curiosity as a personality trait limited to children. We here at A Minor Diner would say those people are stupid.
We were inspired this month by a deliberate, slow-cooked stew, a meeting of three very different minds. The new album Promises, from British producer Floating Points, American jazz saxophonist Pharoah Sanders, and the London Symphony Orchestra.
We've paired Promises with a second-century work of philosophy and a 1995 Super Nintendo platform game. For our appetizer, we have something that should be very, very eclectic, but is extremely ethereal. Floating Points is the professional stage name for Sam Shepard, who is a British electronic music producer. And he has influences from the jazz and classical world and has put out a couple different albums since the midpoint of the 2010s. I particularly enjoy Crush. It's a very sort of mixing electronic elements and classical music seems to be his forte, but does it in a way that the electronic elements and production are almost their own instrument. He's not distorting it or making it weird and clipping it. He's sort of just...
It's very natural.
Yeah. He introduces synthesizers and sampling in a way that's very organic and adds some texture to it.
The music of Floating Points eventually caught the ears of Pharoah Sanders. Now, Pharoah Sanders, big guy in the jazz scene about 1960s, 1970s. He started out his career... He was part of John Coltrane's band for a little while. He was part of Sun Ra's band. Played with Alice Coltrane for a little while after John Coltrane died. And then started as a band leader for mostly... He had a period where he was releasing a couple albums a year. The most famous of which would be Karma, which would be one of the pinnacles of the kind of avant-garde jazz scene of that late 60s, early 70s, kind of focusing on what a lot of people call spiritual jazz. There was also involved in the making of this album. So we've now got Floating Points, we've now got Pharoah Sanders, and they lumped in the London Symphony Orchestra.
Because why not?
Because why not?
What are they doing?
Yeah. It's not like they're doing anything, right?
Yeah.
So coming together and making what is a fantastic album in both of our opinions.
Yeah, it's called Promises, and it sure as hell delivers on those promises.
Yeah.
It is 9 tracks, and they're just called Movement 1, Movement 2, Movement 3. And you have this 7-note melody that just plays the entire time. And it sort of, when I first heard it, it reminded me of like Steve Reich is this New York composer in the early or the mid 20th century who's really into repetition. And I really like that kind of music, that sort of postmodern experimenting with the form in that way. But was a bit surprised the 8th time this melody plays. Of like, okay, so we are doing this.
So we're going for it. Yeah, the first time I heard it, I was a little thrown off by it, I guess, just because I wasn't expecting that repetition piece to be the entire time. It's basically just like a little 7-note arpeggio.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's like a harpsichord at the beginning, and then they also play it on like piano and synthesizer throughout. But it is literally the entire 46, 47 minutes of the album.
Yeah, it sort of provides like a spine. And again, like if you go listen to like John Adams or Steve Reich or things like that, where they'll take the definitive, here is the melody, and I'm going to play it for 48 minutes, and it just kind of builds on itself. And the point of that is like an experiment. But this one, it's like the little piece of dirt in an oyster that makes a pearl. Like it just keeps circling around and getting wider and wider. And I was like blown away because it starts with that. And like you said, the instrument isn't even really tangible of what exactly is this instrument is kind of up in the air the whole time. But then when Pharoah Sanders comes in, not to get into a huge, broad, overarching point here, but like I really, really prefer classical music, like orchestral music. That's usually what I listen to in my free time. And same with jazz. And they both are like two separate things for most of their existence. That orchestral music is very, here's the composer, here's what he did, because it's definitely not a she at that point in history.
No, not very often.
Yeah. And so you get like conductors who will put their spin on things, and certain orchestras that will put their spin on things, like the Chicago Symphony Orchestra or Philharmonic Orchestra is kind of known as being distinct in America. But then you get jazz in the early part of jazz, and it's known for being free form and improvised and things like that. And my two biggest like contentious points of like the later part of the 20th century is that you start getting like jazz standards. And it's like, okay, this seems like a contradiction because jazz is supposed to be, I'm supposed to deliberately hear this artist's take on it. And a jazz standard is sort of, here's exactly what you should do. Here's exactly how it should go. And then this guy, I can't remember his name because I'd rather forget him or whatever. They're like, they decide organically that orchestras and classical music is going to start merging with jazz. And it's just kind of a slow thing that happens over time. But this guy coins the term, like, what is that genre then when jazz and orchestral music meets? And he calls
Jazzical.
You'd think that'd be better, but he calls it third stream. And I'm like, that's the dumbest possible thing you could possibly call anything.
Third stream, baby.
What? Because what does that mean? It's not.
It's the fucking third stream.
Yeah. It's so far above my understanding apparently. But it's like if you look at Promises, it's called a third stream album, and it's like, I can't sell that to anybody. It's like third stream is unbelievably pretentious. So
it's
anyway.
super pretentious. But this is a third stream album, and we will be talking about the third stream this entire rest of the conversation.
Yes, because we're so highbrow and intellectual. But it's the big like tricky thing, I think, when I listen to classical music, whether that's just a piano solo thing or just the orchestra, is how do you record that? Because the two different ways in my layman's ear of the approach they take is either it's like diegetically, so here are the microphones and you can hear the quality of the piano, the quality of the strings and instruments in this specific space.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever this cathedral is or this orchestra hall, or there's a bit more since like the 80s of like, let's make it a vacuum and the music exists outside of time and space.
Yeah.
There's no like quality to it. And then you get this and it's like, okay, this is an impossibility because you're going to get a producer doing his producery things. And then you're going to get, like you said, Pharoah Sanders being very off the wall, wild, improvised jazz. And so are you going to suck the soul out of his whatever, or are you going to somehow make your synthesizer sound textured?
Yeah.
And they seamlessly, like when Pharoah Sanders enters, it's like, it's almost like you're reading a religious document of like, here's the world and God floated over the waters of nothingness.
Totally.
And then here comes humanity and it just sparks. It's incredible.
It's superbly produced. So an interesting kind of point with both classical and jazz. I mean, classical music, I feel like we almost tend to forget at this point that, you know, classical music is meant to be heard in like a symphony hall or whatever, you know, like the space really decides the music. And jazz in a different way was similar, right? Where jazz was mostly about improvisation, and jazz live performances are generally far more well regarded than jazz albums, right?
Yeah.
And then you're putting the two together, and then you're adding these electronic elements, and it sounds like it shouldn't work, and it really, really works.
Yeah, I would say subjectively, because like my favorite type of jazz or era of jazz, I believe you just call this the modal era. So like Miles Davis, Bill Evans sort of era, where it's jazz really trying to reach for more than it was. Like it's because jazz is early 20th century, big clubs, like very eccentric. New Orleans is like, here's all of these cultures. How do they talk to one another? They talk through music. And then you get Miles Davis, and Miles Davis is like again, religious figures. Like he's like the Moses of jazz, where he's like, okay, but we're all existing, but like let's split the seas here and really try to go somewhere. Like he's like almost like a Neil Armstrong kind of not Louis Armstrong, but Neil Armstrong, where he's like, I'm gonna take this like really high intellectual, let's bring what music has been for hundreds of years to jazz, and manages to do it and do it in this way that you can listen to Kind of Blue and it sounds very of its time 50s recording, and you can kind of tell what space and instruments, but they're starting to push up against that limit of let's try to make it like Richard Wagner, if you want to say it correctly. He kind of coins the term absolute music to describe Beethoven, and that means so quick example is like, I write a song about a girl and how much I love her and what I'm going to do to date her or whatever. That would be music that tells a story. And then, okay, I'm going to write a song about just love in general, just the feeling of love or whatever. That would be music that tells an indefinite story, like describes like rain or love or abstract concepts. But then he says that like what Beethoven does is absolute music, where it's music that can't be assigned a context or can't be assigned a any sort of meaning by any outsider or even the artists themselves without being pretentious. And you get promises, which is like, okay, I'm going to take 7 notes and really build that up into some big like snowman. I'm going to keep rolling that snowball, and it's going to be absolute music as well. We're not going to tell a definite story. It's just going to sort of almost like a river. And we're like really bumping up against pretentious things. Two white guys describing jazz. Like, but it's like you start at the very beginning starts with those notes in a complete vacuum, almost like a river would start in the Rocky Mountains, just out of nothing, just like dripping off of the trees. And then as it goes and as it flows, and how new things get integrated, like when, because there's a moment, I believe it's movement 3, where Pharoah Sanders starts, you wouldn't call it scat, but he starts like vocalizing and making sort of just vocalizing music. And his horn sounds so like crusty and rough the whole time, whereas especially then the strings come in, and the strings aren't Hans Zimmer perfect Hollywood dumb cinematic strings. They're like very frayed, and it's just such a weird anomaly of an album.
It's such a strange vibe. I find myself, about half of the times I've listened to this album, it like has put me in a very strange kind of mind space afterwards, and I don't really know how to describe it, and I wouldn't even really call it a positive mind space. So how I would describe the album as a whole, we've got this kind of, the 7-note, like the fixed idea that the whole thing is revolving around. But it, like, to me, it feels like you are almost traveling around this strange unknown, like this strange unknown area, and you're kind of floating around, but this 7-note repeated motif is like the only thing that's keeping you from like floating into the abyss forever.
It's like the gravity, the orbit.
So this is you orbiting around this little piece, and you don't know if the environment around you is like comforting and peaceful, or if it's the complete opposite, where it almost feels like this kind of between world zone. And again, this is getting heady now, but it's funny because like I despite its difference in a lot of Pharoah Sanders' early work, it still kind of has that same spirituality to it, and it feels like it's reaching for something. It feels like it's trying to portray something that is very hard to portray with just words, which is why I sound like a babbling idiot right now.
Yeah, because that's, I think it's like, and I would argue that not, you don't sound like a babbling idiot, but like culture and the world at large does right now, because like you say spirituality, and spirituality is a very definite thing that we've always had, every culture for thousands of years. But spirituality now means something very not hoity-toity, but like woo-woo nonsense. Like to say I'm a very spiritual person is to kind of red flag yourself as being, I'm kind of empty-headed and I don't necessarily want to define my thoughts. Whereas this is like sort of the Neil Armstrong thing. I'm going to shoot out into space and try to grab the divine and make sense of it, because like in regards especially to keeping yourself curious and how do you maintain this, because I prefer, to the point where I would make bold claims about objectivity, that classical music is objectively better than all other types of music, is like how strongly I subjectively feel about it. Like when I was younger, watching Fantasia, and you get to the Rite of Spring Stravinsky segment, and it's all, okay, how do we describe the Big Bang and cells dividing and forming through music, is a very abstract, like you're saying, it has to rotate around this gravity. Alice Coltrane, who Pharoah Sanders worked with, she has a very incredibly good jazz rendition of the Rite of Spring. And so I get a lot of those feelings out of him, where he's reaching for this, the intangible in life. And then Floating Points has like frequently mentioned Bill Evans, who's like an old pianist that worked with Miles Davis and things like that. And I really love his music, and I play his music all the time. But there's this sort of what I prefer music to be is sort of what this album is, where it's a sad album, right? So I'm going to do every song in a minor key, and I'm going to say sad things and do sad, sad, sad to lead the audience towards sad. But this one's like, well, it's in a major key and a minor key, and it's fast and it's slow and it's sparse and it's really condensed. And so that feeling that you're like
Yeah.
reaching at is like basically, okay, so why am I alive? Like, what's the purpose of life?
Yeah.
And it's like the album version of that. Of
Totally.
Like, if you want to be absurd or nihilistic, you can be. If you want to be, I think this album's definitely about the Christian God, then there's enough evidence in it. I think it's about atheism and whatever. I think it's about Buddhism.
Yeah.
I think it's about nothing. I think it's just music or whatever. It has enough there it's so weird. It's like a phantom, it's like quantum computing, basically, or not computing, but just quantum theory of it exists in whatever state you want it to, but also not pretentiously in the same way that someone just throwing, like, I guess the equivalent would be like a Jackson Pollock sort of thing. He can throw paint at the wall and that you can tell there's like a style to it and, and a madness, a method to that madness, in the same way that Rothko can just do red squares and have that like make people cry, but others 50 years later kind of do the same thing. Let me just throw paint at the wall and you decide what it means. Is a very lazy way to do art, but this one is like, okay, there's definitively a meaning to this.
No, definitely. And I think it's good to keep in mind that, Pharoah Sanders is 80 plus years old at this point. He's been around for a long time and he's been exploring these ideas for a long time. This almost feels like a coming to terms with life kind of album, like a exploring the purgatory beyond kind of album. But it's interesting. I've been listening to Karma for a long time, but I had never read interviews with Pharoah Sanders before this dish was coming together. This 3-course meal was coming together, and he is insanely frustrating. I think if I was interviewing him, I would be very frustrated because he doesn't want to talk. Like, he doesn't want to talk to you.
Yeah.
He doesn't, and it's not like your old Jesus and Mary chain interviews or whatever, that they are like purposely antagonizing the interview. It's not that. He's not a dick. It's just he doesn't really have that much to say and he doesn't want to say it. So like the answers, the interviewers are looking for something like, let me get a glimpse of the process. Like, what, how did you make this album? How did you do this? And he says things like, well, we just did it like while we were there. we just improvised. And he said, talking about like making really kind of intense music on some of his 70s works, he just said, I don't know. I was still trying to reach for something. And listening and reading his interviews, it feels like he still feels like he hasn't reached that area, and that's why this curiosity is still alive in him, and that's why he's still like making this new music, is because like he hasn't found what he's looking for. Like he hasn't been impressed with anything he's made, despite the like just objective quality of it.
Yeah.
And he's just like, he's still reaching for this something that, or like this absolute truth or something that doesn't exist, and he's just constantly going for it.
Which is, I would say, some root of to be curious. Because to be curious, you have to inherently like be living in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And even the most successful among us who can say, I definitely live in the moment and I don't have expectations or ambition in that sort of way, it's still a struggle. Like, you still are like, well, where am I eating tonight? I kind of have to base my day around that. But he, I don't want to say more so because it's almost immeasurable in jazz, but like, because at a young age when I was listening to branching out, exploring jazz, it's kind of this contradictory thing of, this is this classic jazz album where they improvised, and in the exact same way they don't want to talk about it, like Kind of Blue. They just sat and recorded that for however many sessions.
Yeah, exactly.
And now it's like upheld as, this is the definitive chiseled in stone like example.
This is the best jazz album of all time.
Yeah, and so kids, because I was reading about Berkeley, the Berkeley School of Music in Boston, and their jazz programs and things like that, and they have this thing, what's the shortest possible way? They have like a standardized collection of jazz standards that they distribute in circles, jazz music circles, just so people, if they're not aware of the standards, know the bare bones minimum. But the problem in the 20th century is that has become seen as like, these are the definitive ways to play.
This is the Bible.
Yeah. Whereas like the artist was just, here's my rendition, and it's not meant to be carved in stone. And so you get, because it's just two completely different worlds, jazz, and then I would argue prosumer music creation now is, even bedroom indie pop is so clean and so devoid of everything. And it's this this Brian Eno quote, I'm gonna butcher it, but his basic statement on like nostalgia is like, each new generation obsesses over the defects of the medium that came before them.
Okay.
So like nowadays, I want my sound to be lo-fi, and I want record scratches, even though at no point in my life was I alive.
Yeah.
Like sound quality and fidelity progressed past that. But to me, this is real in
This
the
is
same
reality.
Yeah, in the same way that they would look at like old bad tapes or scratchy recordings as, oh, this is real music. And so you get Pharoah Sanders, who's inherently just like you're saying, just so in the moment. He couldn't describe what he just did. Yeah. Even though if it was groundbreaking, revolutionary, he doesn't know where he was during that.
If you interviewed him, like, so there's stories of, people that played with him in the 70s that are talking about the recording processes. And they basically said like, yeah, so Pharoah just played, right? Like he just played for 30 straight minutes. And to the point where it's like, we had a thing in the studio where at 18 minutes or whatever, where it's like, okay, it's time to stop. They would turn off the lights in the studio or start fading the lights in the studio. But he was so lost in his own thing. His eyes were completely closed, and he was just lost in another kind of transcendental universe that he didn't even notice half the time.
And that makes sense. That comes through because like, you have the jazz world doing that sort of, I don't exist beyond this exact moment. And so whatever is the note that I'm playing is the correct note. And then you have the opposite, where producers tend to like sterilize and just strangle the life out of their recordings because it has to be perfect.
Because it's hard, because so as someone who like does Ableton electronic music production, it's like, now you just have at your disposal all the tools to make this completely perfect, Yeah. And so because you have that, there's like this tendency to just like obsess over it, especially because there's so much content that you're like, well, this has to stand out by being perfect. Yeah. When in reality, a lot of the things that we now hold up as perfect, if we're talking about Kind of Blue, or if we're talking about Karma, or if we're Promises feels like it has probably, more planning behind it just because of the electronic music piece. But like, these are held up as perfect albums when, the creator has a master plan on Karma. It was like a first take, like a second take.
And it's like 20 minutes long,
and it's 25, 30 minutes long. And it's just like, there we go. We got a guy yodeling over it. Yeah. And we've got it. That's the perfect one.
Because like, usually I always try to bring in this attitude, and it could be pretentious or overbearing, but like, okay, objectivity can exist in art. Like, you can definitively say what isn't art and what is good art. And there's a spectrum there. I would call Promises a perfect album because it's, if you swap out elements of it for other artists or things like that, you could definitely not replicate it. And it's so, because today you get this tendency, okay, just freeform and just do whatever. Yeah. It like is the opposite side of, don't clean up your audio files to whatever extent, but also just sort of riff and improv. And that's where reality is. But I think Pharoah and artists like him, and especially like a Miles Davis, and especially like a Floating Points, there's a discipline that, like Charlie Kaufman, the screenwriter, he's like lauded as this like extremely like experimental, off the wall, groundbreaking screenwriter. But he put in his time writing television stuff and writing standard things. So you learn the rules. It's the classic. You learn the rules so that you can break them kind of thing. But when you get to like, I guess like the Buddhists would call it enlightenment, or just like true detachment from the world, like Pharoah Sanders in that moment, it's all just muscle memory. And so he's allowing himself to experience the moment. And I don't know if I could recommend this album like enough. Like in regards to keeping yourself curious, there's this pretension in the classical music world and also outside of it that well, that's hoity-toity nonsense, highbrow, whatever, intellectual.
Similarly to what jazz has these days.
Exactly. And I would say this is like step number one. Like if you want to actually engage with the music you listen to and try to push your boundaries and expand your palette, Promises is, I think you can play it for anyone in the world at any time in history even. And it sounds like George Washington could listen to this and not be so freaked out of like, what is a synthesizer? Like it sounds completely fine.
Yeah.
And you could play it 100 years from now and it just sounds like that is an interesting philosophical take on life in the form of music.
Yeah, absolutely. Because unlike, I mean, again, I love a lot of Pharoah Sanders' 1970s albums, but they do sound like 1970s like spiritual free jazz albums. There's a lot of squawking. Like I said, there's a lot of yodeling. And I love Floating Points. Crush is very, very good. But it also does sound like, oh, this is a 2017, 2018 like IDM album.
Yep.
And this, I think, doesn't feel like, oh, this is 2021. This is like a out of time, just meditation on something above us. And just trying to explore something that is not easily explored.
Yeah, I would just say dig in, because it is going to taste exactly as good as you want it to taste. It is music for music's sake.
Just like that slow cooked stew, it just gets better the more time it's cooked. A Minor Diner would not be possible without the continued support of our sponsors.
We know, with so many streaming services, it's hard to decide on what to binge next. How are you supposed to know which must-watch content all your friends will be talking about at the bar tomorrow?
Good.
We aggregate all existing streaming services and social media platforms to algorithmically deliver you the next can't-miss phenomenon before anyone else.
Good.
Imagine if you had been the first to recommend Tiger King or Ken Burns' Vietnam War documentary.
Wait, you haven't seen Brunch Hunter? Good.
We'll do the work for you so you can finally be recognized for your good taste. Sit down, shut up.
Good. Have you ever been totally owned in a conversation? Are you on the verge of irrelevance after Sean destroyed your opinion on non-fungible tokens with a quote by Mohandas Gandhi? Sounds like you need talking points. Never get crushed again. Our speech recognition technology records your daily discussions and texts you with the optimal retorts and comebacks you need to score conversational points and bury those ignoramuses in an unmarked grave. Whether it be maxims from Nietzsche or studies debunking any scientific claim, talking points will help you disembowel your intellectual adversaries. For the low price of only $79 a month, never get annihilated, liquidated, or exterminated in a debate again. Talking points. Fuck you, I'm right. Okay, for our entree, we actually have to go way, way, way back in time. We have to go back to the Roman Empire. We're going back to about 100-ish AD.
Yeah, luckily there's no expiration date on this one.
Yeah, exactly. So the Roman Empire, let's talk big picture first, all right? We kind of think the Roman Empire and we're like, oh, well, Italy was pretty powerful. But in 100 AD, the Roman Empire, it was all of Spain, it was all of France, it was all of modern day Spain, France, Italy, lots of Turkey, Greece, even some of England. It was the lion's share of Europe at that point.
Yeah, the whole Mediterranean Sea, the whole thing. Pax Romana, they called it.
Yes. So it was It was large and it was powerful.
Large and in charge.
Large and in charge is how they said it back in the day. And there was an era that is now kind of considered the era of what they call the five good emperors. Machiavelli considered this like the golden time in human history. One historian, Edward Gibbon, said that if a man were called upon to fix that period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the deaths of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. And I'm so sorry about my Latin, which is not very good. But this same time period that we are talking about, okay? And the last of the five good emperors was a man named Marcus Aurelius. He is the man that we are talking about today. Marcus Aurelius, he ruled up until 180 AD.
Yep, just before the 200s.
Yep. So he was a good emperor. He was a well-liked emperor. He was a powerful emperor. He was also a philosopher.
Yeah, they called him the Philosopher King, and have since called him that. Yeah.
Yeah. The last about 14 years of his life were spent up in the kind of northern border of what was the Roman Empire at that point in a series of wars called the Marcomannic Wars. It was basically the Roman Empire against a bunch of Gothic Germanic tribes that were starting to encroach on the power of the Roman Empire. So that's where our dude today, Marcus Aurelius, spent the last good chunk of his life, was up here in these northern battles. And while he was up here, there's not a whole lot of evidence of when he wrote a lot of the piece that we're talking about today, but it seems like the good majority of it was written while he was up here in these northern campaigns, they called them. And he was just writing a journal.
Yeah, basically just for himself. Like, I keep a journal. I keep a daily journal, and I try to encourage everyone to. But when you're at that point, leader of the largest empire in the world, and debatably since, like the most significant, powerful person in the world, that person's journal might be filled with a lot of interesting opinions and thoughts on the world. And luckily for us, Aurelius was a Stoic and was very interested in thinking about things rather than just reacting to them.
Yes.
And so his journal is full of a lot of deep, profound philosophical questions and not assertions, but how should one live one's life?
Mm-hmm. So I guess we'll start out just with kind of a overview of Stoic philosophy, like just a real quick. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of Stoicism right now, but we tend to think now of like the modern definition of Stoic as in, like a Stoic father who doesn't wear his emotions on his sleeves. He keeps them hidden and is, perfectly rational and reasonable all of the time.
Yeah, if not just like repressed as
or
well.
Repressed. Yeah, there's a lot of repression in the modern day view of Stoicism. That wasn't necessarily part of the classic idea of Stoicism. But basically Stoicism is valuing reason above anything else. Emotions come and go, and they're not necessarily to be trusted. You should really look at any emotion you're feeling and instead reason your way through any interaction or action without just falling prey to your emotions. So emotions are kind of a negative. Passions, desires. You should be making sober decision making all of the time. You shouldn't be absorbed in petty things or, revenge. You should be honest, shouldn't be secretive, and you shouldn't be afraid of death.
Yeah, like Stoicism in general, especially now, it gets a bad rap because it means to be Stoic means like a statue. I'm not going to react. I will not have emotions whatsoever. And because he's essentially referring to in AD, 160, 170, whatever, he's referring to people a century or a couple centuries before him and the Greeks. So Stoicism is established as experience your emotions, but don't let them govern you.
Yes.
And like live like a austere and temperate sort of life so that you control. It's mostly about like self-control of like you control yourself so that your impulses and your desires don't control you and dictate what you are going to do.
Yeah.
And again, 5 good emperors out of, I can't even remember how many, there's like 35 or something in Roman history.
There were a lot of them.
Yeah. And so for one of them to be kind of obsessed with what does it mean to be a good human being? I need to be a human being first before I'm an emperor. And he's like known for being very, I'm pretty sure he's adopted into the family, and he's known for being very temperate and austere his whole life. Like he likes to sleep on the floor is what I read. And then his mom says, stop doing that. And he kind of does stop doing that until he becomes emperor and no one can tell him what to do. So he starts sleeping on the floor
again.
Which is a great, because like he quotes Epicurus a lot in this. And Epicurus is a philosopher that I like a lot because he's a hedonist. And hedonism is the exact same thing as Stoicism, where today we see that as, oh, you just do whatever you want.
Yeah.
You just live.
You just fuck.
Yes.
All the time.
That's what it says in Greek. I'm not sure. In Greek it actually is accurate, but in Latin I'm not sure what it is. But really what Epicurus said is, okay, you need to keep your life as close to zero as possible, because then any pain or pleasure you feel is going to be felt entirely. So you're not going to build up calluses, so to speak, and need more and more in pursuit of pleasure in that way. So he's arguing that life is ultimately what you can experience is what you should be focused on, but his is based on temperance. And so Marcus Aurelius takes this concept pretty seriously, I'm pretty sure, his whole life, Stoicism and the teachings of other philosophers before him. But it's there's a lot of political memoirs and political books. In America, at least, what you do is you put out a book before or while you're on the campaign trail to sort of like...
This is just like your manifesto of sorts.
Yes, exactly. Manifesto is the even better word for it. And it's like, here's exactly everything I believe.
Yeah.
And then like the 21st century experience is saying, look at how full of crap they are objectively. Because look, they say, well, I'm really for this and peace and freedom and love and patriotism or whatever. And then what did they do 4 years into that?
Yeah.
Marcus Aurelius is constantly saying, okay, he's got this kind of microcosm and macrocosm thing of, I am the emperor of Rome, and so I'm in charge of everybody, and I'm technically in charge of everything, but the lowest like peasant is in the exact same position I am in, because he's in charge of his own Rome. And so what does it mean? It doesn't matter our station in life. How do I exist as a human being before emperor? And that's sort of what I like the most about it, because he's got some antiquated thoughts, go figure, that he's 2,000 years old. But
yeah, a lot of the kind of existence of like anything that kind of approaches science, like I am made of fire and water and these kind of things, have not, like those are pretty discounted by now. But
he's got statements about slaves and women and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But barely. That's the main thing of like, you really can read this today, and it doesn't require footnotes that are half the page of here's the historical context of what he meant. He's saying, he basically almost takes, because I'm actually going very, very slowly through the Quran at the moment.
Okay.
And he's got some interesting teachings on that, Marcus Aurelius does, where there's a similar verse. I can't remember which surah it's in, but it's like, he who kills one kills all, and he who saves one person saves all of humanity. And Marcus Aurelius says basically the same thing, that you really cannot treat other people poorly. It doesn't make any sense, because you lose your entire humanity. Yeah. And so even if they are evil and bad toward you, it is simply because they're in a different position in life that this is everything is a misunderstanding in his view, which I'm mostly supportive of that. I mostly agree with that.
Yeah, which is something very hard to live by, I think. But like he has a quote that just says, "The best revenge is to not be like your enemy." which is like pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's great because, like, especially revolving around the cornucopia of our theme here of keeping yourself curious, I would argue that we are all a victim to this, and some of us get out of it and some of us don't. But no matter what, you're constantly under threat of this. That I believe it's Socrates that says the unexamined life isn't worth living. And so you get a guy like, because I think the emperor just before him, I was reading about
Antoninus.
I think that's, yeah, someone important to Marcus Aurelius that influenced his whatever, right before he was in charge. He was 70 or 80 something years old and was kind of sick, and then decided to eat a lot of cheese, and then died like 36 hours later. And I was like, yeah, I would probably be pretty temperate and austere as well as the leader. And like, because he talks a lot about like temptations of the flesh, and in modern life, you would want to look at that person. Okay, and then what was their love life like, so that I can discredit them or not. Marcus Aurelius did have like 13 kids, and so I don't know if I would say he was the most chaste individual. But at the end of the day, he refused to be emperor unless he could have his brother, or I think his brother, half brother, or someone also be emperor.
Yeah.
And it's the first time in Rome they're like, okay, I guess we will have co-emperors. Whatever you want, sir. And the political genius move would be like, he's doing that so he doesn't get assassinated, so that the brother doesn't try to take him out. But in reality, he really did truly defer to the Senate and defer to other people's judgment and other people's wisdom. And that's like the tricky thing, I think, when it comes to curiosity, because I find it in trying to cook up a spicy dishes for this month. It's like, okay, what does it take? Why are we not all curious all the time about everything? And I would say it's ego. I think you decide, I've learned enough, I know enough, I can just autopilot any aspect of life that it happens to pertain to, and especially if you're in a position of power.
Because like, this is the emperor. Like, this is the most powerful man in the entire world at that point. Like, right now you could say, oh, well, the president of the United States is the most important man in the planet or whatever. And that is true to an extent. But here, that's like 100% you are the most powerful person on the planet.
Because at the time, like you're saying right now, United States has economic dominance and cultural dominance to whatever degree, blah, blah, blah. But Rome, it's like they know of the Han Chinese, and the Han aren't particularly anything at 600 or 160 AD. And so this is the only thing even resembling a country, let alone it's an empire, a whole continent.
So you are the emperor of this. You are the most important person in the planet. You have like literal statues of yourself on horseback with like little statue people looking up at you in like awe and reverence. And I feel like it's super easy. I mean, it's super easy for me as someone who doesn't know anything about anything to really like get an ego about myself and feel like, oh, well, I don't need a self-help, or I don't, self-mastery. I'm doing pretty good, But what's so interesting, there's two like big reasons why meditations is part of our dishes this time, our 3-course meal, at least from my perspective. The first of which, he's writing this on a basically front lines of a war. Okay, so he's constantly met with the possibility of death every day. Okay, and that is, I guess, a time. You would think it would be a time for reflection, but I don't think a lot of people in that situation use that as a time for reflection. Yeah. So there's a quote from Meditations that says, like, your death will soon be on you, and you are not yet clear-minded or untroubled or convinced that justice of action is the only wisdom. So right off the bat, like, he's going to die in a few years, and he's still saying, like, bro, you haven't done it yet. Like, you are not there. You are not this perfect, logical human being that you want to be. You still have a ton of work to do, which is I think that's an awesome point, and I think that's something that everybody should really keep in mind, that you are not nearly as perfect as you think you are. And like second main reason why I think this is so important to like keeping yourself creative. So the difference between meditations and pretty much almost any other philosophical tome, there are a lot of Greek philosophers that didn't publish anything, but Meditations was never meant for publication. Meditations was literally just Marcus Aurelius's journal, and he just wrote in this every day. He never had any like pretensions of like, oh, I'm going to publish this and I'm going to, make the world a better place. I'm going to do this. I'm going to teach these heathens how to live their silly lives. It was nothing like that. It was literally a journal that he kept that was like chastising himself a lot of the time.
He's very self-effacing about everything. Yeah.
It's basically just chastising himself for a lot of it about how he has not like reached this pinnacle. And these are the things that I believe, and these are the things that I think should be the cornerstones of a well-lived life per se, but I haven't even made it there yet. And then just by kind of happenstance, this doesn't get published for about 1,400 years.
Yeah.
Like, it just kind of survives. We're not entirely sure even how it survives for 1,400 years, but it doesn't get published for the first time until the 1500s, I believe. So I think that's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's a very because like you say, you put on a lot of bells and whistles, even if it's only subconsciously, when you write or do anything for public consumption.
Yes.
And even when you're with yourself, sometimes you might need to pump yourself up and hype yourself up. I'm not doing too bad in this war against these Germans that are just trying to, fight for their homeland. And so to be so constantly critical, because there's a lot of I guess basically I would argue almost any political ideology that's ever existed preaches like self-criticism of we need to be open and we need to be whatever, open to fault and finding fault and seeking change. And then
in practice.
And in practice, none of them do that whatsoever. And so for the guy of all guys, I am at the top of the world at this moment, because the Roman army can also just basically destroy anything in its path. It has trouble maintaining the giant continent that it controls. But for him to be so aware, because he's got so many statements that say, life is not meaningless, but I am aware that I am just like a wisp of smoke, that there was nothingness before I existed, even though the world existed, and the world will continue to exist after I'm dead, but I will again be in an even more insurmountable nothingness, because now I will never exist, whereas before I had the promise of existing someday. Now I will never exist again. And I think for a lot of people, we talk about spirituality when it comes to promises, where that is a very uncomfortable existential thought that strikes, I'd say, any religion especially, but mostly people who try to embrace their spirituality. I remember there was, whatever her name is, Carl Sagan's wife, continually was asked, like, well, did he recant? Did he say he was going, or not recant? Did Carl say he was going to become a Christian? Did he renounce his atheism, whatever? She said, no, never did. And like, well, what about you? Would you like to be a Christian? And she says, no, we are well aware that we existed at the time we existed together, and we will not be, and that's why it's beautiful and this and that. And if that's, what they believe, that's great. But you're rarely confronted on that until your deathbed of like, oh, wait, what is this brief candle in the dark that represents my life? And that is a disarming and disabling thought for an average person to have.
Yeah.
But then when someone's knocking on your door every 5 minutes of like, sir, you have to run the country, which is also the world, like Western civilization, for him to have found the time, like you said, because I remember I read the memoir of Ulysses S. Grant last year, and the first third of it and the last third of it are like fantastic, because they're his ruminations on growing up, and he talks a lot of crap of like, we should not have taken Texas. It was illegal how we took Texas. Shouldn't have done it. Don't like it. But then the middle is so boring and just a bunch of troop movement nonsense. And it's not as poetic as he actually was. And you get a lot of that with like, I'm trying to remember, like Sun Tzu, when he does the Art of War, is very poetic and very philosophical in that sense. But it's rarely like so feet planted on the ground, tangible, like Marcus Aurelius, like he makes it. This is a very popular book these days, the 21st century. This gets recommended a lot. I know like Penguin Classics reprints it all the time. And like business CEOs will use Art of War to try to, I'm calling on ancient knowledge to sell more napkins.
Printers.
Yeah. But then I think Meditations is similar to, there's a lot of self-help books out there, and Meditations is sort of, okay, this one, though, is actually rooted in reality. Like, this is someone who legitimately knew what they were talking about and is open with their struggles and is trying to find an answer rather than talking down to you saying, here's my philosophy.
You need to do.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's what's interesting is I feel like a lot of self-help books are this is what you need to do. And Meditations is this is what I need to do. Like this is how I become better because I am not perfect. I am not the one that is like, perfecting you like with my sage-like knowledge. That's not what this book is. And yeah, to kind of switch gears a little bit, I feel like Meditations is like this really, really awesome keeping your creativity alive kind of book, and just like continuing to attempt self-mastery, like seeing yourself as not a completed person and just continuing to reach out into whoever knows what. And that honestly, the parallels between Marcus Aurelius and Pharaoh Sanders are really interesting to me. Like, one is a Roman emperor, one is a jazz saxophonist. So we're dealing with different, different things here.
Barely.
Yeah. But like some of the quotes that I was looking at from Pharaoh Sanders for this episode.
Because also, for what it's worth, Pharaoh Sanders was basically, if not literally, essentially homeless when he first started. So he was did not come from some sort of highbrow intellectual arts family or anything like that. He was just a guy that
was just a dude,
dressed humbly and acted humbly to start.
So it's interesting in Meditations. Meditations never really talks about like the war that's happening. It's very much like Marcus Aurelius trying to figure out, how to live his own life. And there's a New Yorker interview with Pharaoh Sanders that kind of speaks similarly. And the writer is writing, after the fact about the interview. And he says, quote, "We talked about his beginnings as a musician, his approach to recording over the years, and his collaborations with jazz legends. But Sanders was more inclined to reflect on the challenge of finding a good reed than to dilate on his legacy. What really mattered, it seemed, was his feeling that he could never get it right. Over the course of the conversation, it became clear that he wasn't being compulsively hard on himself or willingly obvious. Rather, he was still searching, possibly for something that he knew he would never find." And there's quotes like, the interviewer asks Pharaoh Sanders the question, "Do you feel like you've ever had a moment or a record where you've been like, I got this one right?" And Pharaoh just says no, and that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah,
and that's like, damn.
And I would say, because that's a very poignant point that you make. Yeah, because I would argue that curiosity is basically like this itch, and it's a good, virtuous itch to have because you're pursuing something more. You're fighting entropy in a certain sort of way. But at the end of the day, like, the best artist or the best human being is someone who stays curious. And so in order to do that, you're constantly in a state of unknowing and not accepting what you currently have. Because let's take Alexander the Great. He's sort of defined by, I'm going to push myself to be the best leader of men and push the empire as far as possible. And then he dies, and then it breaks. But Rome doesn't break after these 5 good emperors, but he's not so concerned, because there's a lot of minutia you can get into with Marcus Aurelius, where he changes the value of the currency, like in the way that we would hear about today, the Federal Reserve. He's doing all of this sort of minutia to the country, or to the empire, and it comes at this constant killing of the ego that I am in charge, because he would frequently talk to the Senate and ask permission of the Senate of things that he didn't have to ask permission of. And there's a sort of humility in that. And like a big broad point that I want to contribute to yours is, I think that in order in the 21st century to keep yourself curious, you have to be mindful and disciplined with what you choose to integrate into your identity, and or identify as, is what I should say. So meditations reminds me in a weird way, and forgive me if this tangent goes all circumnavigates the globe here, but it reminds me of Mao's Little Red Book, because in Mao's Little Red Book is this book of his quotations when he becomes chairman, and they start mass shipping those things out to Chinese citizens.
Every man, woman, and child has a red book, and they've got to memorize it too.
Yes, and so it's like it's like second to the Bible in terms of literally, this is the second most printed book in existence. And so Marcus Aurelius is known as this philosopher king, even when he's alive, and he's just existential, and he's constantly questioning everything all the time. And then Mao is known as like a warrior poet, like for most of his life, because he's on this military campaign that lasts from like the 20s and the early 30s the 20s when the Civil War really starts to heat up, and then Japan invades, and then the Civil War resumes after that. He's constantly writing poetry as they're advancing and retreating everywhere. And so you get in both of these works, they're talking about life, and it's very valuable because I think, like you say, they're on the front line, so they're confronting what does it mean to exist and for what purpose. And so Marcus has this great take on Stoicism, and then Mao has this very, very good, like brilliant observations on the contradictions that exist within groups of people or just the human being itself. But then a big contentious issue I have with the 21st century is a way in which you choose to describe yourself to others, or you see yourself as, oh, I'm a this. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal. I'm a conservative. I'm a Tory. I'm a Labor Party, whatever. And I would argue pretty staunchly that to be political is to be a-curious, to lack curiosity, because
to be this. Right, like,
yes.
I don't know if I agree in terms of like to be political in the giant realm, the giant sense, to be politically active, but to be this, to be either a communist or to be a Democrat, like anything in between.
Yes, which I mean, there's stuff on the other end too, but because inherently you're putting a box around it.
Yes.
And once you put a box around it, you're saying, okay, imagination, okay, curiosity, don't go outside of this thing. And so when you get these two figures like this, the third book that I would compare this to is, right now I'm reading The White House Diary of Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
And he's very much the same, of like, hey, at the beginning of this book, I'm going to tell you, I made a lot of mistakes, and I messed up, and I was acting in the moment, and guess what? I'm not going to edit those out of my diary. Like, this is literally what I was keeping. And he's very stoic, and he's very austere, where he doesn't like, we're going to stop doing motorcades because it disrupts traffic and blah, 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 blah. And meditations in the same way, a little bit like Mao, because Mao's quotes are from just different things he's writing over the course of 20 years. And so I would say that the foundations of curiosity is a constant self-criticism that I might believe this, like let's say human rights. Human rights is a political issue, but you cannot wake up today with the exact same opinion you had tomorrow, because inherently you're being some degree ignorant. It's important to be very politically active and constantly trying to move the flag there. But if you get to the certain point, I'm an X, that means I've decided anything coming my way, I'm going to filter it through this
Yeah.
rather than stay curious and adapt my worldview to that. So, yeah, Meditations is sort of a very, very, very good mark of, I know a lot of political leaders have read it as well and like to quote from it, and their histories aren't so, comparable to Marcus Aurelius's. But I think in regards to curiosity, Meditations is sort of this totem or omen. It's basically almost a foreshadowing that in order to do this, you're going to have to be as unpretentious and unegotistical as one of the greatest emperors that ever lived. Yeah.
So I just want to finish on just like 2 quotes. And one of them is from Marcus Aurelius, and the other one is from Pharaoh Sanders, because I'm just gonna keep making that. The first one is a long one, so I'm just gonna kind of paraphrase it. But it starts out saying, we should also attend to things like these, observing that even the incidental effects of the processes of nature have their own charm and attraction. And he talks about bread baking and says that the cracks in bread can be perceived as a failure of the baker, but it can also catch your eye and give particularly like stimulus to our appetite. Same thing. Figs likewise burst open at full maturity, and in olives ripened on the trees, the very proximity of decay lends a special beauty to the fruit. And just like this, paying attention to every little thing, being curious about every little thing, and kind of seeing the beauty and the kind of contradiction in everything. And then there's a quote from Sanders where the interviewer is just asking him like, what are you listening to these days? And the Pharaoh Sanders says, I haven't been listening to anybody. And the guy says, not even older stuff? And he says, I haven't been listening to anything. I listen to things that maybe some guys don't. I listen to the waves of the water, the train coming down, or I listen to an airplane taking off. And it's like such a different answer to that question, in that like, yeah, I don't care. I listen to what I want to listen to. I don't need to listen to music. I listen to the beauty around me. And it's like, why doesn't everyone do that?
And I would argue that's why Promises is so profound, is that it's not, well, I was influenced by this guy who was influenced by this guy, this guy, this guy, this recursive thing. It's how on earth he found floating points then if he's not listening to anything.
I know, that's what it went through my mind too, but
insane. And for our dessert, we bring such a sweet and savory dish. It is the 1880s. Japan has a simple economy.
The 1880s?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Japan has a simple economy, a very simple economy. There aren't many luxuries. You buy what you need. But a man by the name of Fusajiro Yamuchi takes a risk. European playing cards are popular, but kind of illegal too. But he opens a shop, as if to say, I'm going to sell Japanese playing cards, which serve as items for artists to show their talents and customers to engage their imaginations. In 1889, he founded his company, calling it Nintendo Karuta, which means leave luck to heaven. 100 years later, Nintendo had grown to be one of the largest companies in Japan and the world itself as a leader in video game development. There is a long-running debate about whether or not video games can be art. One side would assert that not only can they be art, but they are. That if a medium itself can be art, then every work in that medium is inherently a work of art. Others, like myself, would argue that there are mediums of art, sure, but a minimum level of resonance, craft, and imagination must be evident in the work for it to be considered a good work of art, regardless of what medium it's in. The year is 1990. 100 years after their founding, Nintendo puts out the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, a home video game console. They release a game called Super Mario World, where the player controls the now famous Italian plumber Mario on his quest to rescue Princess Peach yet again. But this time, Mario isn't entirely alone. Nintendo introduced the character of Yoshi, a green dinosaur that Mario can ride and befriend. Yoshi can stick out his tongue and eat enemies, he can run fast and jump high, and his little noises are quite sweet, so people grow to like him. Super Mario World is a huge hit and almost instantly regarded as one of the best games of all time. Nintendo could very easily release a quick sequel, a new adventure for Mario, and a continuation of that story. Players were familiar with the mechanics, it was a winning brand, and they could have very easily replicated every aspect of the game with superficial additions and made a ton of money. But Nintendo instead took a second and thought, wait, what if instead of resting on our laurels, we attempted one of the single most creative endeavors in the history of this dumb planet? Let's try that. In 1995, after 4 years of development, Nintendo released a prequel to their previous masterpiece, in which Mario is now a helpless baby. The stork carrying him and his brother Luigi is attacked. The brothers are separated and fall to Earth, landing on an island. Mario must be reunited with his brother and brought to their parents. But you don't play as Mario, because not only is he a baby, but that'd be too easy, cliché, and not nearly inventive enough. You play as Yoshi, in a video game that I would contend is one of the top 100 most creative experiences in the history of the human race, in a work called Yoshi's Island. When it comes to analyzing a work of art, the medium dictates the criteria. So if you're looking at a statue, the color, material, style, and maybe the likeness are things that you should be paying attention to. In video games, you can look at the art style, the sound, the characterization, the story, the music, and almost just as many aspects as film or literature or any other medium. But a video game is a game, and a game has to have an objective. And so contrary to what dirty, smelly gamers might tell you, the experience of a video game cannot be measured solely by the satisfaction of winning, because winning itself can be subjective. There are many types of games, but one of the common tenets is that you are a vulnerable entity who must destroy other vulnerable entities so that you can get what you want. But this would be a narrative choice, not a requirement of an art form. In Yoshi's Island, there's no health bar and there's no countdown clock. You have Mario on your back and you can travel as fast or slow as you want to on your quest to find his brother. But if you're hit by an enemy, a creature that wants to steal Mario, he falls off your back and he will cry until you're reunited. And as anyone who's ever played the game will tell you, he definitely cries and you'll definitely notice.
He's annoying.
If you don't go pick him up before a timer runs out, you lose the level. You may destroy the enemies that are in your path if you want to, or you can simply jump around them. Or, because it's one of the best works of art ever made, you can eat enemies and poop them out as eggs, which will follow behind you, bouncing as totems of your aggression. You can throw these eggs at other enemies or use them to solve puzzles, but literally nothing you do in the entire game can absolve you from the simple fact that the further you progress on this journey, the more danger you and baby Mario are in. Most protagonists and heroes are depicted as being good and righteous in their efforts, but aren't really shy about accepting the glory and rewards that come with their victories. In Yoshi's Island, you play as the ultimate altruist, finding a baby and searching for his brother, with no reward promised, expected, or even possible for reuniting them. This granting you not just an objective to pursue in a video game, but a philosophy to consider in life. And the heart of every player is tested with the slow realization that, in a game that measures your success by the love and proximity you share with this child, each new step you take may bond you, but truly saving him will mean having to say goodbye. Every work of art is a series of choices. In creating something, the artist decides color, texture, sound, volume, and a million other parameters. Sometimes these flourishes are accidental discoveries. Sometimes they're the result of a lot of trial and error. But every aspect of a work of art reflects a choice that the artist made. In good art, these choices are the result of curious minds, not embracing the world for what it is, but asking what it could be. Computer graphics, a sort of quasi-3D, was popular in the early 90s and seen as the future style that all games must adhere to. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, served as a producer on Yoshi's Island, a game that bucked the trend and defied expectations. scaring shareholders and delighting the public with its deliberate and bold choice to adopt a sketchbook and hand-drawn art style in complete defiance of what people thought they wanted. The box art for this game, just the package that contained the cartridge, is still regarded as one of the most iconic images of the art form, not just for those who were children at the time, but those realizing the potential imaginative power of the industry. The game represents the moment that an industry began to truly contribute to culture. Since its release almost 30 years ago, Yoshi's Island has been seen as one of the few perfect works in its medium, containing some of the most creative music, art design, gameplay mechanics, conflict resolution, and storytelling present in an artistic work, distinctly displaying the virtues of working to maintain a curious mind. So Yoshi's Island as a dessert is a rather obvious choice, in my opinion, that taking what is standard and what is, accepted to be a video game and flipping everything on its head is indicative of a design team, or at least a group of artists, saying, what is each individual atom or element of a work of art, and how can we flip this around? And so when you were growing up, what role did video games have in your life?
I was a large video game player. I think I got on it relatively late because my parents didn't want to get me a game console. And then, which was the smart move, because then as soon as I had one, that was all I did. But I was also mostly a PlayStation kid instead of a Nintendo kid. So I enjoyed your TED Talk about
Yes.
about Yoshi's Island.
This is my manifesto. We talked about manifestos. Yoshi is the way. Yoshi is the only
Yoshi
one.
manifesto.
The true God.
The Jesse Yoshi Stewart. The Treble Chef manifesto.
The Third Testament. The Gospel of Yoshi.
Yeah, so I don't have as strong of an opinion about Yoshi's Island. I think it's a fun game, but I also had I had a Nintendo Entertainment System, but when I was in like high school, I had an NES, and I had Super Mario Bros. The first like true Mario game, and I could almost argue that for its time period was the same as Yoshi's Island, in the sense that it is like a perfect encapsulation of video game making at that time. I think the creativity at play was insane. And I want to know why Yoshi's Island over anything else, especially why Yoshi's Island over like Call of Duty World at War.
That's going to be such a tough thing to say, just shooting mindless, whatever.
But they introduced new guns since Modern Warfare 2.
Yeah, that's true. It's all this fun sort of quantum killing, how we can do further. Because I'd say two things with that. Yeah, like Super Mario, the original Mario Bros. On Nintendo Entertainment System is sort of like a Charlie Chaplin perfect. Like the first level of the first world of that game is perfect because there's no tutorial, there's no instructions, there's no language. Yeah. And if you look at it from a directing standpoint, or a whatever you want to call it, not even just games, but artistically speaking, you need no outside knowledge, period. Like it subconsciously teaches you how to play the game. That was so unbelievably influential that like Yoshi's Island is known as a platformer. And so these 2D side-scrolling games there where you hit A to jump and you run around, Mario doesn't invent that, but Mario takes it from, most of these games are pretty good, to like, okay, this is like universally relatable to every culture, we can all appreciate this. Yoshi's Island, basically they consciously stopped, because you get Super Mario World, which is the equivalent, the next video game console Nintendo puts out, the next Mario game, and they have a tradition of like, okay, here we're gonna swing for the fences again of how do we revolutionize whatever video games are in this moment. How do we truly blow the doors off of it? Yoshi's Island is seen as like the last actual like 2D platformer, to where if you were to take what's the last silent film, it's like you can argue the artist in some sort of way of like the last
Because
legitimate
I would argue there are a ton of 2D platformers
today.
after Yoshi's
Yeah.
Island, but like we're talking marquee games. Like
Yeah.
this was the last one.
This is the last because 3D graphics are starting to be integrated. Like Donkey Kong just came out, and it looks like it's 3D, but you're only on a 2-dimensional plane there. And so Nintendo is telling, okay, we're going to start doing this. We're going to start implementing 3D into the games. And one of the things that happens, because people, not to be so blasé and insulting, but people aren't very intelligent. And so when you say that, like, should we do this painting in a 3D render, or should we do it in this technique of art that's been developed over 3,000 years? Or should I do it as like a Monet, or should I do it on a 1999 Mac, iMac, whatever?
Yeah.
Which one of those is going to age better? And is always the traditional.
We always go with the iMac, though.
Well, we always do, and it's always so great. It's always wonderful. Toy Story looks fine today. Fine. Passable, accepting, or whatever. We're about 10, 15 years from little 3-year-olds laughing at it of like, I am not watching
We're a
this
few
trash.
years away. Yeah, I think we're close.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate. But like, yeah, I wasn't really aware of the time period. So for me, basically the history of video games was like, I have a PlayStation 1, and so this is the beginning, you know.
Oh yeah.
But I remember growing up as a Wii base chef. There was a place over by like somewhat near my house called Nicola Play, which was a bit of a misnomer. It was an arcade that on the surface you would pay a nickel for each play, but you'd get to a game and it'd be like, you need 6 nickels. so like, no.
Yeah.
But my favorite game and my reason for going to Nicola Play was a game called Primal Rage.
Okay, yeah.
And if you're unfamiliar with Primal Rage, it came out either the same year, or when was Yoshi's Island out?
95.
95.
Yeah.
Okay, this was 94.
Right.
94 is Primal Rage, so about the same time period. And if you were so Primal Rage, it's like 3D modeled like Jurassic Park dinosaurs, and you just beat the shit out of each other. It's just a fighting game. It's basically Street Fighter, but with like these weird 3D dinosaurs. And while I thought it was the coolest thing on the planet when I was a small person, it hasn't aged particularly well. And looking at gameplay of Primal Rage is like, this looks weird.
It makes your eyes water.
Yeah, it looks bizarre. Like just the movements of these bizarre 3D models is like a little. It doesn't do good things for your brain.
It's disturbing. Yeah.
But like, you could come out with Yoshi's Island like today.
Yeah.
And it would be like, wow, this is still a pretty solid artistic statement.
And I mean, it's one of those, because just as an overarching statement, I grew up with video games to whatever degree. I had a cousin gave us a Super Nintendo that she wasn't using, then N64, Xbox 360, and that's about where I stopped. I appreciate games and I value games to whatever extent, but I do feel that they have not been well reined in and disciplined, and I feel that they have a negative impact on our culture and on our world at the moment. I don't think, in the same way that the early days of film is essentially just watching a bunch of flashing lights on a wall somewhere, and it's like, okay, son, you need to pick the crops. We're starving. Like, please. And he's just obsessed with like, but these blotches almost look like a train. Like, it's not quite reached. I think video games are, they lead to addiction. They lead to a certain, like I was saying, life is a game, and a game is to be won, and winning means dominating that which opposes me. And so any human being on the planet is either my unquestioning ally, where everything I say is law. An NPC, nothing, no person, their opinion doesn't count, their whatever, or there's something to be dominated.
Yeah.
And so you get Yoshi's Island, and Mortal Kombat's huge at the time. Video games.
Everybody's playing Primal Rage at the Nicola play.
They just can't get enough of it. There's so many nickels flowing in there. And at that time, that was a lot of money. But Yoshi's Island takes this very conscious, okay, we are going to dial this all the way back and make sure that it starts at Eternal. And you can sort of see that today. What I mean by the video game culture sort of thing, I think it's a pretty toxic, unhealthy culture 60-70% of the time. I don't think that it has a lot of discipline between the game developers and the players a lot of the time. I think you get perfect works of art that can only be games, but those are, for every one of those, there's 100, like you're saying, addictive, game on your phone or, blasting people's heads off for the simple sake of doing it, not for like any narrative reason.
It's just because you can.
Yeah. And so Yoshi's Island sort of dials back, okay, everyone wants 3D graphics, too bad. Everyone's really kind of into 3D, barely the early technology, three-dimensional movement, too bad.
You want to dominate?
Yeah.
Too bad. You got to take care of a baby now.
Exactly. Well, because your health, if you get hit, you get killed. How about not?
Yeah.
Well, there's like, okay, but you need to rush through the level as quick as possible so that you can get to the end. How about not? And so Yoshi's Island is like the first, at the time, people didn't even know what to make of it in a like extremely positive way. They'd say like the world is just huge and it takes forever to get through the levels in a great way. Like I can go explore and see whatever I want to.
And there are 72 whole levels on a 4 megabit cartridge.
Yes, because whatever, I don't even know what the percentage would be, but your phone has just infinitely more processing power than
4 megabits.
Yes, like you can, yeah, it would take, anyway, yes. And so they take, why I contend that this is such a, like out of the human race's existence, this is one of my like subjective and then objective argument that Yoshi's Island represents something, is you could very simply redo what you had just done. Nintendo's a big company, but they're not huge. And so we do have to pay everybody and we do have to keep the lights on. And so it doesn't make enough rational sense to bet the farm on the sidekick dinosaur who doesn't talk from Mario, and also take away. There's instances of this in like if you look at superhero movies. Again, not to be insulting and blasé or whatever, but they start screeching if Thor can't be the coolest guy ever. Like if you ever remove anyone's like how cool they are and how their ability to dominate, they need to live vicariously through these entities.
This isn't about weakness. This is about showing the strength. This is about showing perfection, something to aim to or whatever, like an ideal. Yes.
And so you get Mario, like Super Mario, and it's got the landscape and it's got its enemies. Who are the enemies? Well, they're plants with big spikes on them and big mountains and this and that. Yoshi's Island says, okay, let's lean all the way into like not adolescence, whatever you'd call being a child, a true child, and how you would see the world. And so you're seeing the world through Mario's eyes, essentially, but you're dealing with it through Yoshi's eyes. And so if Mario gets knocked off your back, there's a timer that then starts that you can only be separated for so long, and Mario starts crying. And it's not so lighthearted at that point because they're trying to kidnap Mario. And so you get these little bandits and things, and they'll grab Mario and they'll run, and they can run 90% of the speed that you run. And so you're like, me in the back of the car playing this on my Game Boy is like, oh, I understand what it means to have kids now. I understand why my parents are so, because this was the game where I like piped up at dinner one day and Jesse, would you ever want kids? Yes. Because I've played Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. Because there's a general, again, I can just do a mountain in the background. I can draw a mountain. No one's going to care about the mountain in the video game because we're just running past it. But in this one, the mountains have eyes and they have sort of like a goofy expression and they're in this hand-drawn sort of way. Every enemy isn't really just reused from previous Mario games. They're their own thing with their own little cultures. Like people have talked about going back to play this game 30 years later now. And they say, sometimes I just stop and I just watch everything the game interacting with itself and kind of marvel at like what happened over the last 25 years. There's this game that basically has like an ecosystem in and of itself. Again, you can just run through the level as quick as you want, speed run it, or you can sit there and listen, because like the music is, again, back in the day, you can't fit music has memory on a game cartridge, and so you can only fit certain tones and sounds and only so many of them. And so that's why the Mario theme is so perfect, is because it's massively constrained.
Yes.
That they have to be creative and curious of how do I do the best with absolutely nothing in my toolbox. Yoshi's Island is like, it'd be so easy to just do a tropical theme or just a baby theme, because that's what you do today is, oh, Mario's a baby and he's so cute, and Baby Yoda.
Baby music.
Yes, exactly. But there's this sort of inventive, what does it feel like to say, okay, we just met and I got to reunite you with your brother. We're best friends, but we got to get to know each other now. Like this sort of pre-destiny, like because Yoshi and Mario are destined to be friends, but how did we meet? And the themes are incredibly good and incredibly sometimes dark. Like there's a song, the very final boss at the end. You can find plenty of like metal covers of it on YouTube because it's such an aggressive guitar track back then. And I remember seeing that when we were looking for daycares for me when I was younger. And they had a Sega Genesis and there was Sonic doing his quasi 3D stuff. I was like, oh, we should go here. Sonic is cool. I like this. Yeah. And then I saw the next one and it had Yoshi's Island. And I was like, this is the single greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't even know what this is. Is this a movie or a TV show or whatever? Because it was just so inventive, the movement and the animation, similar to like Studio Ghibli now, where they can crank out great two-dimensional works that, yeah, theoretically you'd say the style is of the early 90s, but they look eternal, like how you can look at Snow White now from the 30s, and it doesn't necessarily age in that way. And so, like, there's just so many lessons I look back on, and maybe I'm innocent and naive of I learned all my lessons in life from Super Mario World to Yoshi's Island. But there's this moment where there's these big fuzzy creatures or whatever, and if you touch them, the level's called Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy, and like you touch them and Yoshi gets like high and he gets too high, and so the whole level starts like contorting and distorting, and the soundtrack gets really, really out there and Boards of Canada weird. And you can't do that too much because Yoshi gets too high. And I was like, okay, so when the DARE officer comes to my school, I understand that Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy is both a statement endorsing and condemning drugs. And so this is how you should be approaching life. And so anyway, getting to the full, like, what does this mean in regards to curiosity and regards to our dishes? Yoshi sort of upends things, and upends because people didn't even know how to play it when they first started, of like, where is the health bar hidden and where's the timer, because I need to speed through this. If you speed through it, it's a little bit weird. The enemies aren't quite designed to be that. You're supposed to take your time and get to know Mario. And again, with each new level, you're realizing, but if I win, the whole time I've been taught is that Mario needs to be with me. And so the ultimate resolution in life is that Mario's going to leave if I truly win. And so maybe I should take a bit more of my time and collect every certain thing because I'm inevitably reaching this. And just like, and I'm sure this is what they were thinking when they designed the game, just like Marcus Aurelius, when he's thinking about the battlefield of to fight for Rome and to make Rome Roman and to make the world Roman. What does that mean? This temporary existence in life. What does it mean to be alive? And in Yoshi's Island, I would argue it's the complete antithesis to most, okay, like almost every video game, because almost every video game, unless it's like a puzzle game, has this inherent good guy, bad guy, shoot, shoot, bang, bang, stomp on their heads,
Yeah,
whatever.
like Animal Crossing or something.
I love Animal Crossing, but
Yeah.
you're naming like one of the 5 games that I actually play. But similar to that, and similar to Promises, the album, of it sort of takes this general, let's go back to Promises, the very conventional, actual literal horn that he's playing. You can hear how antiquated that sounds. You can hear it sounds like his horn. It's not a new horn that he's playing. It sounds, there's a rough texture to it. It's the same sort of thing with Yoshi's Island. Like, okay, we're going to stick to, this is what it looks like when kids draw things, and this is what it would look like. And so when we're talking about, it wouldn't be, well, it's kind of almost infanticide of killing kids is what all of this island wants to do. The kid is going to see everything. Oh, look how green it is and this and that. But Yoshi's going to have to jump through of like, yeah, this little bat is trying to like kill you, Mario, decapitate you, Mario. But then you get the other side, the floating points of, okay, but what does it mean to like create music in 2021? Polished, smooth, clean, and sort of ethereal, impossible to pin down. There are elements of Super Mario World to Yoshi's Island that take computing power at that time to its limit, where it's creating 3D textures and 3D models of things. And when you get high, like there's not enough computing power in the world to do that in the old Mario games.
Yeah.
But in this one, you sort of are taking the old and the new and making a very conscious effort out of it. And so when it comes to video games, Yoshi's Island required such a verbose and elaborate introduction in this case because video games at their worst can be seen as like, it's just something for kids and it's just a know-nothing, flashing lights, press A, just addictive, like World of Warcraft players get addicted to that and they leave their family lives, and it's every bit of a disease that alcoholism is. It's an addictive, it exploits addictive personalities in people. But Yoshi's Island represents the exact same, like why it should be considered an art form and why the gaming industry itself, because I think it wasn't another 15 years before Nintendo themselves put out another console 2D platformer, because this was the high watermark. And it sort of, for me, illustrates, like as I was saying about choices, because you get Yoshi's Island and everything is just evident of like, well, this is what they look like and this is how they move and this is how everything interacts. But for any artist, they have to start at ground zero and decide, so what is it going to be? How many legs is it going to have? What color is it going to be? How are we going to make the color palette palatable and engaging? And Yoshi's Island, again, I would contend, takes the least amount of given of like, well, this is just what enemies are. This is what video games are. This is what everything is. And they say, okay, what is it in our game? What does Mario look like in our game? What is the colors? What is a blue? Because there's not really like a dark blue in this game. They have like a specific Yoshi's Island shade of blue. And so in regards to keeping yourself curious, you have a pretty substantial album that questions the simplicity of life. And then you have a philosophical tomb that says, again, question everything to the point of discomfort constantly. And I think that when you get to dessert here with Yoshi's Island, it displays like, but this is the nectar that you're fighting for, is that it's not just like a true, good, fulfilling life that you should be pursuing eternal curiosity and questioning yourself all the time. Here's what you can see. You can see a whole new shade of the world, a whole new perspective of the world if you question enough of it. So back to my point about politics being somewhat a-curious, is if you're aiming for some form of a utopia, which is somewhat a pragmatic utopia, that if we just voted exactly my way, we would achieve this reality. It's discounting all of the other beneficial realities and all the other outside sources from other political ideologies that you could use to create a more sustainable reality. So Yoshi's Island came out back in 1994, and that was a time when video games were the hottest craze because politicians were scared of their influence, children were obsessed with their relevance. but adults struggle to make sense of it all. And there's this famous unstaged photo of a young mom playing her children's Game Boy, and she's helping them to beat a level. And the wide-eyed boys and girls are just marveling at her ability. And they all have their heads pressed together because the screen is so small at the time. And it's not necessarily what's on the screen because they can only each get a fraction of it. It's that their imaginations are working overtime. They're taking these images and these little fractions and converting them to a collective imagination together. Because gaming was once a very communal activity where players would play with one another on the same couch. And so they'd fill their living rooms with laughters and cheering. And at the time, this would have been one of the only TVs in the house. You can't just retreat to another screen and have it be a solitary activity. I remember when I was a kid, my father, mother, and we would play Super Mario World together and struggle to beat the levels. And these are, baby boomers that have never played video games in their lives. And me, I don't even know my ABCs yet. I'm trying to figure out what any of this means. And I remember one snowy day calling my dad at work because I was so jazzed that I had beaten the first boss in Mario World. And he wasn't supportive of me as a dad or whatever. He was legitimately excited because there was this thing, oh, now we get to see what's on the next island, the next world, the next whatever, because it was an art form similar to movies or paintings or literature that ignited our collective imagination. And so Yoshi's Island is not just some relic of nostalgia or some kind of museum exhibit, because you can pick it up today and it's just as good, if not better, than it was 30 years ago. Nintendo continually re-release it for new consoles and handheld devices because people of all ages keep playing it. There's a minor phenomenon of American adults who were parents in the 1990s choosing to have the ending credits music of Yoshi's Island played at their funerals. And it's not because they're geeks or nerds or that some old video game was the only culture they experienced, but the opposite. Because to them and millions around the world, Yoshi's Island represents a fountain of youth, one which bathes the imaginations of both the most impressionable and the most jaded, and reminds them that, just like the baby who fell from the sky, their sense of curiosity must always be nurtured, protected, and allowed to thrive. And so when it comes to our three dishes here, I would hope that you, the humble, stoic diner now, ideally, have come to understand maybe that curiosity can only be maintained by a changing definition of success, of wherever you are in life. You must be constantly breaking everything down into its atoms and recontextualizing them for your life.
In terms of Yoshi's Island, so video games, I feel like some can see almost a lack of curiosity and a lack of creativity in video games because the player is not necessarily doing anything, right? The player is experiencing something that somebody else made. It in the same way that some might say the same thing about music or movies, where it's these are things to just be devoured,
Yeah.
We should just listen to pop music because it's poppy and it's catchy, and we should watch movies because they're entertaining, and we should play video games because life is pointless, so now let's find a point in let's play Primal Rage and be the other monkey, right? But I think all three of our dishes today prove that even in the most unlikely of circumstances, whether it be a large platformer or if you are the most important person in the world and you should think yourself perfect but you're not, or if you're an 80-year-old saxophonist that people haven't really paid attention to in a little while, all three of those areas you can still find creativity in, and you should still strive to find that creativity in, because if you don't have that, what else is there?
I would agree, and I would say that in the same way that life imitates art and art imitates life, that art today, like you said, it's an escapist. Just don't question it. Just take it. Just scoop it all in there. In these moments, curiosity is defined by active participation, and so art should be measured by its willingness to actively participate with you and learn something from one another. But if for some reason you, if that just didn't do it for you, also on the menu this month, we have Lost Girls with their new album, Menneska Kollektivet. The Norwegian duo, who includes art pop superstar Jenny Haval, their debut is surreal and audacious, a release expected to unfold with many further listens.
Dub Harp's Spiral Heights is like floating on a small boat in the middle of the ocean, but the ocean is Nintendo 64 32-bit water, and it's pulsating with strangely calming currents of electricity.
Igloo Ghost put out another album called Leyline Eon. The British producer has put out yet another superb record of classical music elements clashing with deep, dark electronic sounds, culminating in an atmosphere just as abrasive as it is soothing.
Gengistron Dream Weapon. The cybergrind band and mainstay of my middle school iPod Shuffle returns with their first release since 2008, displaying a much more subdued and meditative direction.
It's been a pretty good month. A lot of good stuff on the menu. So we're glad that you weary diners have now come into our establishment and leave now as stoics, content with the world and happy with your place in it.
Curious stoics who don't believe themselves perfect at all.
No, emperors of your own islands, your own Yoshi's Islands.
Well, before you head off into the night, we should go back to the kitchen and read. We've got some very good notes to the chefs.
Yeah,
So,
come on back. We start out by introducing last month's question: what work of art is or was ahead of its time? And our wonderful diners have written in from all over.
So first we have Max from New Jersey. He says, Third by Portishead is always my default answer for this because it sounded like nothing else in 2008 when it came out, and 13 years later, I can only think of one album that really has moments that even remotely sound like it. Sure, it clearly takes cues from film scores like the first two Portishead records do, but it sounds like music recorded both on and inside a rib cage. I don't even know how to describe it. It's just one of the best albums I've ever heard, and it still feels fresh and new every dang time.
I agree. That one, they came out swinging like no one. That was after some degree of a hiatus, and
Yes.
they knocked it out.
Like a decade, and then they just come back, and it's like, that's still honestly one of my favorites of all time as well.
Absolutely. Yingshu from Wuhan, China says, the Star Wars prequels. People have hated the Star Wars prequels, episode 1, 2, and 3, for a long time now. But now that the Star Wars sequels have come and gone, they look back on the prequels fondly. This just goes to show that sometimes the not-so-good stuff becomes classic simply because new stuff keeps getting worse. And I completely agree. People do this horse crap argument that, like, well, you can always go back, and, like, it's always still there, and, you know, it's not getting ruined. I don't think you can watch Star Wars in the same way, knowing that there's 80% of them are not good anymore.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I do disagree that the Phantom Menace is even tolerable, though. That is a worthless, horrid piece of garbage.
You have Duel of the Fates, and that's good. But I remember even at the time, as a racing fan, like, these are just Formula One engines over the pod race. Like, this isn't even anything. But anyway, they shot it on film. It's great.
Anyway.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Disagreed. We've got Elle from New York. She chose Gustave Courbet's The Painter's Studio. This painting was done in 1855. The art world was slowly moving towards modernism, but it hadn't fully entered into that period. Most contemporary work was romantic or pre-Raphaelite, works dealing with an external fantasy. This painting is a representation of Courbet's internal memories and experiences as an artist. The portraits of people surrounding him are real-life people. It's important to note that Sigmund Freud was not a thing at this point, and it wouldn't be for a couple more decades that the idea of psychology even became mainstream. Courbet even conflates the space of the painting, breaking a hard painting rule that the space of the painting was clearly defined. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I really like that painting. I think it's a very interesting. You don't have any other real, other than theater, like visual arts at the time in that way, and I think it's playing with all that fun postmodern stuff.
Yeah, it's postmodern before modernism.
Yeah, so take that.
So take that.
And Nikki from Albuquerque, New Mexico says, anything by Yoko Ono. And normally we try to limit these down to like one work of art, but she has a pretty good point here. Yoko Ono plays with a lot of ideas that the irony-loving artists of social media and influencers are repeating today. Yoko's Wish Tree is a project where passers-by are invited to scrawl a hope or dream onto a piece of scrap piece of paper and hang it on the tree. Reiterations of the Wish Tree can be found in museums and gardens all around the world today. The Wish Tree concept reminds me of the new age self-help artistic Instagram personalities who throw around words like affirmation and manifestation. You can grab some of her songs to fit my claim that some of her music sounds like David Bowie before he was David Bowie. Perhaps Ono's Move On has similarities to Bowie's Be My Wife. Maybe that's a stretch. Perhaps it's the chaos of airmail that made me think of the crunch and tension of Station to Station. Gosh, I don't know. But I'm a Yoko girl, and I think you should be too. And I think that's a pretty fair point, because I think history is only going to be more kind to Yoko Ono, that maybe the four Beatles had some degree of autonomy and responsibility and maturity in breaking up, and that it wasn't one young girl just saying, don't do this anymore.
You know, like recently, so they released that Britney Spears documentary on Hulu. So now, because all the world is a groupthink, everybody is like, now Britney Spears is a perfect human being, and like, you know, free Britney or whatever people are saying on Twitter. But Yoko Ono never had that. And Yoko Ono hasn't got her fucking Hulu documentary. And she should get, honestly, a lot more credit for pushing avant-garde music for, I don't know. I'll talk good about Yoko Ono at any time.
And not even just avant-garde music, but like purposeful, thought-out avant-garde music. Of this is going to be what on the outside would sound like a bunch of shrieking and like paint thrown on the walls. But she has a very clear artistic statement with it all. So what would you say in terms of art that was or is ahead of its time?
I went back to 1974 and chose the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Hell yes.
When this was released in 1974, I honestly felt like if you had seen this in a movie theater in 1974, it must have felt like the work of like a true psychopath, because it was like nothing else at the time. There were grindhouse movies, but nothing felt like this dirty, this grainy, this disturbing, while still being like a very well shot, well thought out movie. I believe that it really kickstarted modern horror, and that the entire genre, the entire 70s and 80s, like the true heyday of the genre, really would not have been the same without it.
I agree, and it's like one of my favorite artistic facts in existence is that Texas Chainsaw Massacre, those nouns together, there is no blood in the movie. It's insane. It's a masterpiece, absolutely. Yeah.
What do you choose?
I think when you get questions like this, it's like, you know, things that predict the future, and then the future is only still temporary. So things that predicted today are only true as long as today stays the way it is.
Okay.
So you get a film like Network, which kind of predicts the news cycle and things like that. But even before that, back in 1957, there's a movie called A Face in the Crowd. And Andy Griffith, it's what introduces him to the world. He's the lead in it. And he plays this sort of down on his luck, drunk cowboy kind of guy that they prop up and pick up and put out on stage to play country music and sort of do like a Glenn Beck, Tucker Carlson, like talking at the audience about political points. And then they show just how quickly they can yank that stage out from under him if he doesn't follow what they want to do. So yeah, for 1957, it was like, you know, military industrial complex, get ready. This is what it's going to look like facing
Yeah.
the crowd. But
Dang.
yeah, it's not bad. But yeah, we love hearing from our diners. And so for this month, a particularly stoic, thoughtful, curious month, we would love for you to write in and tell us, what is a piece of art that gives you a childlike sense of wonder?
Yeah, what you've got that feeling of childhood where everything feels new and novel and amazing. What piece of art kind of returns you back to that feeling? You can write into us at aminordiner@gmail.com, or just message on our Instagram, message on our Facebook, comment on YouTube, fax us, whatever.
Yeah, we'll take carrier pigeon as well. But thank you so much for dining with us tonight. I'm sure our bellies are just completely full with nice, stoic,
Mine is.
16-bit or however many bit thoughts to consider. So please be sure to thank your hostess, Miss Mandy Groves, on your way out. And be sure to wave to Edward Tart on keys, killing it as always. A Minor Diner is recorded on location and produced by Epicene Motion Picture Company. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you here again real soon.
See you soon.